In my video last week, I reviewed the series premiere of Hammer House of Horror. In this video, I'll be looking at the second episode of the series, titled The 13th Reunion. The episode was released on October 20th, 1980. Veteran television writer and actor Jeremy Burnham wrote its teleplay, with Hammer regular Peter Sasti directing. The episode follows Ruth, a reporter for the women's section of a newspaper, as she uncovers a sinister cannibalistic conspiracy theory. Ruth is played by Julia Foster, with George Innes, Richard Pearson, James Cosmo, Warren Clark, and Gerard Kelly rounding out the cast. With this brief context laid out, let's review The 13th Reunion. The story unfolds through a slow burn, a ridiculously slow burn, clearly trying to stretch the story out to fit the necessary runtime. This kills the tension of the narrative, especially once it becomes obvious what the twist is. This makes the episode drag on painfully, with little to keep your attention. It's not funny or fun like the previous episode, with only a few winks and nods at the audience, teasing the twist. I find the central conspiracy of the narrative to be somewhat interesting, but the ending reveal is unsatisfyingly executed. This ending is disappointing, and showcases some of the major restrictions of the show. We get a final death that is not shown, akin to the first episode. Unlike the off-screen death in the first episode, with the clever usage of the puppet burning the witch, we get a cheap cutaway gag, with a butcher knife being raised, a shocked look flashing across Ruth's face, and a swiping down of the knife coinciding with a cut to black. Roll credits. This feels so cheap and tacky, trying to stay within the restrictions of not only the budget, but also television censorship. The budgetary and censorship restrictions imposed on the show hampers any truly gruesome or bizarre imagery from being showcased. Instead, we get a few drops of blood and one well-executed car crash scene. That car crash scene, which occurs early in the episode, is the best scene of the episode. It showcases some clever filmmaking tricks and makes you feel the character's paranoia and his growing detachment from reality. It's a tantalizing glimpse at a much more interesting show. Unfortunately, from that high point on, it's a long drag towards an unsatisfying conclusion. Moments that are supposed to be shocking, such as the grave digging from Ruth and Andrew, uncovering the body having been replaced in the coffin, fall flat. There is a complete lack of satisfying payoff, and the slow burn approach to the plot fails to capture your attention. This approach for this episode showcases that sometimes our imagination is not enough to conjure up horrors. Sometimes you actually have to show us something. Like with the first episode, the acting is okay at best, though perhaps the size of the cast and the scope of the episode create more weak spots than in the previous episode. The pilot localizes things within very few locations and features very few characters. This episode feels stretched too thin, with not enough good actors, plot points, writing, directing, or effects to make any sort of impact. It makes it so nothing in the episode stands out in any meaningful way. Sasti's directing is also only okay at best, with the aforementioned car crash scene the only thing that rises above the otherwise bog-standard material. There aren't any special effects to mention, as nothing is shown at all in this episode. It's trying to rely on a growing sense of entrapment in a paranoid conspiracy thriller style, but also gives away the twist too soon. Giving winks and nods to the audience undermines the ability to be immersed in the narrative and care for Ruth. The humor of the episode also doesn't work, with the constant jabs at Ruth for being overweight being ridiculous. I don't care that she is wearing that baggy sweater, in no world is she overweight, which also undercuts the narrative. How am I supposed to believe that she is doing undercover reporting when she's so clearly out of place? I find this casting to be very bizarre in this context. I understand that they are basically onto her the whole time, but everything about this episode just feels so haphazardly put together and half-heartedly executed. Despite the flaws of the first episode, I enjoyed its fun and charm. This episode feels like an empty attempt at filling an hour of airtime. I'm disappointed in this episode, as it could have been executed much better, even given the clear budgetary restraints. However, the writing, directing, casting, and acting all lead to a very generic and boring slog of a mystery that has no satisfying payoff. That's all I have to say for this episode. What's your thoughts on the 13th Reunion? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.